The moment Grace Lawson stepped off the stage in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, the wind hit her so hard it nearly stole the black mourning ribbon from her hat, and she thought that perhaps the territory was already trying to take the last of what she had left. She stood on the packed dirt of the main street and looked up at the expanse of sky that rolled over this place like an ocean she had never seen, vast and blue, and indifferent to everything that had happened to her in the past 14 months. Boston felt like something she had read in a book and half forgotten. The parlor with its velvet curtains, the piano she had played every Tuesday evening, the smell of her late husband Edmund's pipe tobacco curling through the halls of their townhouse, all of it sat somewhere behind her now, packed away not in her single trunk, but in the locked room at the back of her chest where she kept things she could not bear to look at directly. Edmund Lawson had been a good man. She wanted people to know that about him because it mattered more than anything else she could say. He had been kind in the way that some men are kind without even knowing it, the way breathing is effortless and continuous. He had laughed easily, held doors without being asked, and brought her wildflowers wrapped in brown paper every Friday, as though 14 months of marriage had not dulled the habit he had started when they were courting. He died of a fever in October of 1880, 17 days after she first noticed his hands trembling at the supper table. He was 31 years old and Grace had been 26, and the world had continued turning as though nothing remarkable had ceased. She had tried to stay. Her sister Catherine had urged her to stay. Edmund's mother had clutched her hands and wept and told her that leaving Boston would be a betrayal of his memory, which Grace thought was a profoundly unfair thing to say to a widow who was barely holding the pieces of herself together with the force of sheer stubbornness. She had stayed through the first winter, stayed through the spring and the summer and the second winter, and then one morning in March of 1882 she had woken before dawn, looked at the ceiling she had stared at every night for 14 months, and understood with a clarity that felt almost violent that she was disappearing inside those velvet curtains, and she needed to go somewhere that did not know her name. A cousin of Edmund's, a man named Gerald Lawson who had gone west several years prior, had written letters that spoke of the Kansas territory with a breathless enthusiasm she had always found mildly irritating. Now those letters were the compass she used. She wrote to Gerald and told him she was coming. She told her sister Catherine that she was going to visit for the spring, which was not entirely a lie, because she could not bring herself to say she was running, even if that was precisely what she was doing. Gerald met her at the stage with a hat that was too large for his head and a grin that made him look younger than his 34 years. He had set himself up as a land agent in Caldwell and lived in a modest frame house on the edge of town with a housekeeper named Mrs. Beale, who regarded Grace's arrival with the measured tolerance of a woman who had seen many things in her time and had opinions about most of them. The town itself was alive in a way that Boston had not been for Grace in a long while. Caldwell sat on the Kisham Trail, and the cattle drive still moved through it, though the drive season had not yet truly begun, and the town was in that brief, deceptive lull between the quiet of winter and the roar of summer when cowboys arrived, in numbers sufficient to overwhelm every saloon and boarding house and any peaceful citizen who happened to stand in the street at the wrong moment. Even in the lull, there was noise and color, and a kind of rawness that made Grace feel as though she was touching the world without gloves for the first time in a very long while. She told herself she had come to rest, to breathe, to let the flat grasslands and the enormous sky push out everything that had accumulated inside her. She told herself she would stay a month, perhaps 2, and then return to Boston with something refilled inside her. She told herself many things in those first few days as she helped Mrs. Beale in the kitchen and walked the dusty Main Street and watched the men in their worn boots and wide-brimmed hats move through their days with an ease that looked almost like freedom. She did not expect to notice Roscoe Barlow at all. He came to Gerald's office on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after Grace arrived, and she was in the outer room organizing the files that Gerald had left in a state of cheerful disorder when the door swung open without a knock. The man who walked in was tall and lean in the way that men who work outdoors become, not thin exactly, but drawn down to the essential parts, with weathered brown skin and dark eyes beneath the brim of a hat that had clearly seen its share of weather. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two more, with the kind of jaw that had forgotten what it felt like to be clean-shaven for longer than a day at a time, and dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck where it had grown past cutting. He stopped when he saw her because he had clearly expected the office to be otherwise occupied. "Gerald around?" he asked. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not feel a need to prove anything. "He stepped out to the land office," Grace said, setting down the papers she was holding. "He should be back within the half hour." The man nodded and looked at her for a moment with a directness that she found both slightly startling and somehow not rude, as though he was simply a man who had learned not to look away from things that were in front of him. "You'd be the cousin from Boston," he said. "I would be," Grace said. "Grace Lawson." "Roscoe Barlow," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "I run cattle up from Texas to the rail at Abilene. Gerald handles the land arrangements for grazing when we hold the herd near town." "That sounds like a complicated business," she said, mostly because she felt the need to say something. "It's got its complications," Roscoe agreed, and he looked around the office at the disordered stacks of paper and folders with an expression that suggested he understood them entirely. "Gerald's good at most of it." Grace almost smiled. "He is. The filing is not among his gifts." Roscoe looked at the papers in her hands and then back at her face, and the corner of his mouth pulled slightly upward in a way that was not quite a smile, but was clearly the direction one was going. "I'll wait outside," he said. He went out and Grace stood in the office holding the papers and telling herself there was nothing remarkable about any of that, and then went back to the filing, which suddenly seemed slightly more interesting to accomplish quickly, so that she could be standing near the window when Gerald returned and greeted his visitor. She was not, she decided firmly, going to be ridiculous about this. She was, as it turned out, only somewhat ridiculous about it, which she considered a reasonable compromise under the circumstances. Gerald returned and had his meeting with Roscoe and Grace, served them both coffee from the pot she had maintained on the small stove in the corner, because Gerald was the kind of man who always forgot to tend to the coffee himself. She did not sit in on the meeting, which was not her place, but she heard the low murmur of their conversation through the thin wall, and once heard Roscoe laugh, a brief, genuine sound that she found herself cataloging the way she used to catalog particularly interesting passages in the novels she read. When Roscoe left, Gerald came into the outer room and poured himself a second cup of coffee and looked at her with the expression of a man who had noticed something and was deciding whether to say anything about it. "Good man, Roscoe," Gerald said. "Known him 6 years. He drives for himself now, got his own herd. About 400 head he brought up from Texas 3 years back and has been building since. Not a rich man by Boston standards, but a man who's built what he has with his own 2 hands." "You're being very informative," Grace said. "I'm a land agent," Gerald said happily. "Information is my trade." She said nothing further on the subject, and Gerald had the wisdom not to push, which she appreciated about him more than she had previously acknowledged. 3 days later she saw Roscoe again. She had taken to walking in the late afternoons when the sun was not at its full ferocity, following the track that ran south of town along a creek lined with cottonwood trees whose pale green leaves had just come in with the spring. She had found that an hour of walking settled something in her that nothing else had managed to settle, and she had begun to think of the walk as a small private ceremony that belonged entirely to herself. She came around a bend in the track and found Roscoe Barlow crouched at the edge of the creek with his hat on the ground beside him, washing something in the water with the careful attention of a man engaged in a task that required his full concentration. He looked up when he heard her footsteps and straightened, reaching for his hat. "Mrs. Lawson," he said. "Mr. Barlow," she said. "I didn't expect to see anyone here." "I come here most evenings when I'm in town," he said. "The quiet's good." She looked at the water moving over the stones and understood exactly what he meant. "Yes," she said, "the quiet is exactly what I came here for." He regarded her for a moment. "Gerald said you'd been through a rough stretch." She felt the familiar tightening that happened whenever anyone spoke directly about Edmund, the sense that her grief was somehow being handled by someone who might drop it. But there was nothing intrusive in the way Roscoe said it. He said it the way he seemed to say most things, simply, without embellishment, without the uncomfortable sympathy that most people offered, and that Grace had found, over 14 months, more suffocating than comforting. "I lost my husband," she said. "A year and a half ago I needed somewhere new to breathe." He nodded. "That makes sense," he said, as though that was simply the most reasonable thing a person could do and required no further examination. She stood for a moment longer and then said, "I'll leave you to your quiet." "You don't have to," he said. "Creek's big enough for both of us." She almost kept walking. She very nearly said something polite and continued down the track, which would have been the sensible thing. Instead, she found herself walking to the bank and sitting on a smooth, flat stone about 8 feet from where he had resumed his crouching position. And for the next half hour, they sat by the creek in the late afternoon light and said almost nothing at all. And it was the most peaceful she had felt since before Edmund got sick. She did not examine this too carefully because she had decided to be less ridiculous, and examining it carefully would have been the most ridiculous thing of all. The spring deepened towards summer, and Grace did not go back to Boston. She wrote to her sister Catherine and explained that the rest was doing her good and she was extending her stay. Catherine wrote back with 3 pages of gentle concern and one sentence that said plainly, "I hope you are not hiding, Grace." Grace folded the letter and put it in her trunk and thought about that sentence for several days before acknowledging that Catherine was at least partially right, and then deciding that partial hiding, when a person truly needed it, was not a sin that required immediate repentance. She had made herself useful in Caldwell, which was the surest way she knew to keep from thinking too hard about the things she did not want to think about. She helped Gerald with his filing and correspondence. She assisted Mrs. Beale with the household, becoming genuinely competent at making bread in the cast iron oven, a skill she had never needed in Boston where a cook had seen to those things. She began, tentatively, to acquaint herself with the other women of the town, Clara Webb, who ran the milliner's shop with a directness that Grace admired, and Mabel Oates, the schoolteacher, who was 23 and fiercely intelligent and reading everything she could lay hands on, and several of the ranch wives who came into town on Saturdays with their children and their lists of necessities. She did not think of herself as becoming part of the town. She thought of herself as visiting, an extended visit, a season of rest. She kept this distinction carefully in her mind, because collapsing it felt like betraying something about herself she was not ready to let go of. Roscoe was in town more often than the nature of his work might have suggested, which Grace noticed and refused to draw conclusions about. He came to Gerald's office regularly on matters of legitimate business. He appeared at the general store on occasions, when Grace happened to be replenishing supplies for Mrs. Beale. Twice he was at the afternoon creek when she walked there, and once he was not, and she found herself aware of his absence in a way that she found mildly alarming. They talked, not about deep things at first, but about the things that were immediate and real, the weather and the grass conditions, and what the railroad was doing to the cattle business, which Roscoe discussed with the careful attention of a man who understood that his livelihood sat at the intersection of forces larger than himself. He asked her questions that were genuine rather than polite, the kind of questions that wanted actual answers, and she found herself giving them, which surprised her because she had grown accustomed in Boston to giving only the answers that fit comfortably within the frame of what people expected. He asked her once what she had loved about Boston, and she thought about it for a long moment before saying, "The library, the music, My husband's laugh, my sister's stubbornness. What didn't you love about it? After Edmund died, everything felt like it was behind glass, beautiful but untouchable, like I was looking at my own life from the outside. He was quiet for a moment, watching the creek. That's a hard way to live, he said. It is, she agreed. What do you love about this? She gestured at the open land around them. He thought about it with the same honest attention he gave everything. The fact that it doesn't apologize for itself, he said. It's hard and it's beautiful and it doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. I respect that. Grace looked out at the flat grassland stretching to the horizon under the enormous sky, and thought that she understood exactly what he meant, which she found both thrilling and slightly frightening, because understanding a thing and Roscoe Barlow's way of seeing it were beginning to feel dangerously connected. The drive season began in early June, and Roscoe's herd came north with 20 other drivers' cattle in a great, noisy river of livestock that filled the air with dust, and the sound of thousands of hooves, and the calls of the drovers working the edges. Roscoe was gone for the push to Abilene and then the return, and Grace told herself during the 2.5 weeks he was absent that this was clarifying, that this was the normal rhythm of his life and perfectly fine, that she had been comfortable before she knew him and would be comfortable without him. She was not entirely comfortable. She helped Clara at the millinery shop and assisted Mabel Oates with organizing the school library, which was a single shelf of worn books in the corner of the one-room schoolhouse, and she took her afternoon walks and sat by the creek and told herself she was resting, which was still true. It was just that resting felt slightly less restful than it had before. When Roscoe returned to Caldwell in late June with trail dust still on his coat, and a look in his dark eyes that was the look of a man who had done a hard thing well, he came to Gerald's office and Grace was in the outer room and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her and said, "You're still here." "I am," she said. "Good," he said, and the word was simple and unadorned and landed somewhere in the center of her chest with a weight she felt for the rest of the day. They had dinner together for the first time on a Saturday evening in late June, at the hotel dining room that served the best meals in Caldwell, which was a modest boast but not an inaccurate one. Gerald came along, which was entirely appropriate, and the three of them sat at the table near the window that looked out on the main street, and Gerald talked about land prices and the prospects for the coming season, and Grace and Roscoe listened, and occasionally exchanged the kind of glance that exists between people who share a private understanding of the world, which Gerald noticed and was very carefully not saying anything about. After dinner, Gerald said he had paperwork to attend to and excused himself with a transparency that was almost admirable, and Grace and Roscoe stood on the boardwalk outside the hotel in the blue summer evening, and for the first time there was a different quality to the space between them, an awareness that had been growing quietly for weeks and was no longer quite as manageable as it had been before. "I'd like to show you something," Roscoe said. "If you're willing to ride, can you ride?" "I learned in New Hampshire when I was 12, she said, "though I haven't ridden in some years." "It comes back," he said. "Saturday morning, I'll have a horse ready." She agreed before she had time to be sensible about it, and then walked back to Gerald's house in the warm evening air and told herself, this was simply two people enjoying the company of a mutual acquaintance in a perfectly appropriate frontier context, and then told herself to stop being absurd, because she was a widow of 28, not a girl of 16, and she was allowed to acknowledge that she was enjoying herself. Saturday morning, he brought 2 horses to Gerald's gate, a solid bay for himself and a gentle sorrel mare for her that he had clearly selected with care. Not a trail horse, but a smooth-gaited animal that would be forgiving of a rider who hadn't sat a saddle in years. Mrs. Beale watched them ride out from the front porch with an expression that combined deep satisfaction with studied blankness, which was Mrs. Beale's version of minding her own business. He took her north of town, away from the trail, to a place where the grasslands rose slightly into a long, gentle ridge, and from the top of it you could see for what felt like forever in every direction, the land rolling away in every shade of green and gold under a sky that was almost violently blue. It was the kind of view that made you feel small in a way that was not frightening but somehow deeply comforting, as though the world was large enough to contain everything that had happened to you and still have room left over. Grace sat her horse at the top of the ridge and looked at the horizon for a long time without speaking. "Nobody in Boston showed you anything like that," Roscoe said, not as a criticism of Boston, but simply as a statement of geographical fact. "No," she said, "they really did not." He smiled then, a full smile, and she saw that it changed his whole face, the way a fire changes a room. She looked away before she could think too carefully about what she was feeling and focused on the horizon, which was safer and also genuinely magnificent. They rode for 3 hours and talked the way people talk when they have been waiting to talk without knowing it, moving from one thing to the next with the ease of a conversation that has been in progress somewhere beneath the surface for a long while. He told her about growing up in Tennessee, the youngest of 4 boys, about coming west at 17 because the land there felt used up and something in him needed to go where things were still being begun. He told her about learning the cattle trade from a man in Texas named Hector Vargas, who had been doing it for 30 years and knew more about cattle and weather and the character of the land than anyone Roscoe had ever met, and who had treated him fairly when he had been a young man with more ambition than money, which Roscoe clearly remembered as a debt he intended to carry with him. She told him about Edmund. She had not told many people about Edmund in any real way, because most people when they asked about him were asking how she was managing, not who he had been. Roscoe asked who he had been, and so she told him the law office, the Friday wildflowers, the way Edmund had argued politics with her father at the dinner table with genuine passion, and then laughed about it afterward, the way he had held her hand during the thunder when he thought she was afraid, even though she was not particularly afraid of thunder, and had simply let him hold her hand because it seemed to make him happy to be useful. "He sounds like a man worth grieving," Roscoe said. "He was," Grace said. "He was worth every bit of it." There was nothing uncomfortable in saying this to Roscoe, which surprised her. She had worried, without precisely articulating the worry, that acknowledging Edmund's worth to Roscoe would be complicated in some way she could not name. But it was not complicated. Roscoe received it the way he received most things, without flinching, as simply a part of the truth of who she was, and that made her feel more herself than she had felt in 2 years. July arrived with a heat that flattened Caldwell and made the main street shimmer in the middle of the day, and drove every sensible person indoors during the peak afternoon hours. The cattle drives continued through the heat, and the town was full and loud with cowboys spending their wages, and the saloons doing the kind of business that kept the local sheriff and his deputy in a state of continuous activity. Grace had met the sheriff, a careful man named Amos Pratt, who was good at his job and fair in his judgments, and was quietly in love with Clara Webb at the millinery, which everyone in town knew except apparently Amos Pratt and Clara Webb, or possibly both of them knew, and were doing nothing about it for reasons that Grace found somewhat maddening. She had also met several of the cattle drovers who came through, men of various degrees of roughness and generally harmless intent, though not always. There was an incident one evening in early July when a drover named Calder, who had been drinking since noon, decided that Grace was worth approaching with a degree of persistence she did not appreciate, and she was standing outside Gerald's office when this happened, and she was in the process of delivering a refusal that she felt was sufficiently clear when Roscoe came around the corner from the direction of the livery. He read the situation in approximately 2 seconds, which Grace observed was a skill he possessed in other contexts as well, and he stepped up beside her and looked at Calder with an expression that was not threatening but was entirely without ambiguity. "This lady's with me," Roscoe said, quietly, in the same unhurried voice he used for everything. Calder looked at Roscoe and made a rapid reassessment of the situation and moved on down the street without further comment. Grace looked at Roscoe. "I was managing," she said. "I know," he said. "I could see that, but I figured you might prefer not to have to." She thought about this for a moment. "That was carefully done," she said. "I try," he said. "You said I was with you," she said. He looked at her with those direct, dark eyes and said, "Only if you want to be." It was the most direct thing he had said, and she felt it with a clarity that left very little room for ambiguity. She held his gaze for a long moment and then said, "I think perhaps I do," and she meant it in the way that one means things when one has stopped pretending. He smiled, not the full smile but the other one, the quieter one that lived at the corner of his mouth, and was somehow more intimate than the full one, because it seemed to be for her specifically. After that, the nature of things between them was somewhat more openly acknowledged, at least to themselves and to Gerald, who received the news with a composure that suggested it was not news to him at all, and Mrs. Beale, who said only about time, and went back to her bread dough. They walked together in the evenings, not every evening but often, and he came to dinner at Gerald's house twice a week, and she learned things about him that filled in the outline that had been forming since the first Wednesday he walked through the office door without knocking. He was not an educated man in the formal sense, but he was an intelligent one, which she found mattered considerably more to her than the formal kind. He read when he could, mostly practical things but also history, and he had opinions about what he read that were not borrowed from anyone else. He was patient in the way that people who work with animals learn to be patient, understanding that the world moves at its own pace, and that pushing against the pace is mostly wasted effort. He was also, she discovered, a man who remembered things, small things she mentioned in passing, things she did not think were significant, and brought them back days later in ways that made her feel profoundly attended to. He had a camp north of town where his small crew lived during the summer months, and he invited her to come for a meal one evening, just her and Gerald, and she met his crew. A young man of 19 named Tommy Reyes who had come up from Texas with him, and who Grace suspected Roscoe quietly looked after in the way that older men look after young ones who have less than they should in life. And a taciturn man of 40 called Hank who said very little, but was clearly deeply competent at everything he did, and a third drover named James Calloway, who was Irish and full of stories that got progressively more embellished as the evening wore on. She sat by the campfire with these men who lived their lives entirely outdoors, and listened to James Calloway tell a story about a horse that grew more spectacular with each retelling, and watched Roscoe across the fire, watching her, and felt something shift inside her that she recognized as a kind of opening, a door that she had believed was sealed against the weather coming back onto its hinges, and she was not afraid of it. She realized with something close to wonder, not afraid of it at all. There was a complication, as there must always be in things that matter. It arrived in the form of a letter from Edmund's mother, a woman named Lawson, who had been formidable in her grief, and who had apparently, through Catherine, learned that Grace was still in Kansas, and further that she seemed to be finding it agreeable. Eleanor's letter was 3 pages long and constructed with the care of a woman who understood that words were weapons when deployed correctly. She spoke of Edmund's memory and of family duty, and of what Edmund would have wanted, which Grace noticed Eleanor had always been very confident about, and which Grace thought was a complicated claim to make about a man who was not present to confirm or deny it. The letter did not mention Roscoe by name, because Eleanor did not have his name, but it spoke in general terms about the importance of returning to familiar and appropriate surroundings, and the kind of life that Grace had been raised to lead, and the implication was clear enough that Grace could read it with complete understanding. She sat with the letter for a day, which was more than it deserved, and then she thought about what Edmund had actually wanted, which she believed she knew better than his mother did. Edmund had wanted her to be happy. He had told her this. In one of the last lucid conversations they had before the fever claimed him fully, he had held her hands and told her that the only thing he wanted from whatever time remained and whatever came after was for her to be happy, fully and genuinely happy. And she had told him to stop being morbid, and he had laughed and said he was not being morbid, he was being practical. She wrote back to Alina with more gentleness than Alina deserved, and told her that she was grateful for Edmund's memory, and that it lived inside her and always would, and that she was well and intended to remain so, and that she hoped Alina was also well, and she folded the letter and sent it and did not write a second draft, because the first draft was already kinder than her initial instincts had suggested. She did not tell Roscoe about the letter immediately. She told him a week later, on one of their evening walks, partly because she had been thinking about what the letter represented and wanted to speak it aloud to someone who would not be alarmed by it. "Someone thinks you should go back," he said. "It was not a question." "Edmund's mother," she said. "She thinks I have a duty to a life I've already lived." He was quiet for a moment, walking beside her in the warm evening. A meadowlark somewhere in the grass was singing with an enthusiasm that seemed to be purely for its own pleasure. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think duty to the living matters more than duty to the dead," she said. "Edmund would agree with that. I know it." He looked at her. "I'm glad you know it," he said, "because I want to say something to you and I need to know you're not going to vanish back to Boston before I say it." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The meadowlark continued its argument with the evening. "Say it," she said. He turned to face her, and she saw the thing in his eyes that she had been watching move closer for weeks, the thing that he had been careful about because he was a careful man, and she understood that it had taken something from him to let it come this close to the surface. "I have not been looking for anything," he said. "I want you to know that. I have been content with my life and my work, and I have not spent my time looking for something I thought was missing. And then you walked into Gerald's office and you were there, just completely and entirely there, and I have not been fully settled since that morning. I think about you when you're not in front of me. I think about whether you're at the creek and what you're thinking and whether you had a good day. I am not a man who speaks this way easily, but I am also not a man who mistakes what he is feeling for something other than what it is." Grace stood very still. The grassland stretched away around them in the late light, golden and immeasurable, and the sky above them was shifting into the first colors of evening, rose and amber and a deep, impossible blue at the horizon. "Roscoe," she said. "You don't have to say anything back," he said. "I'm not asking you to. I just needed you to know." "I do have to say something back," she said, "because the thing you are describing is not entirely unfamiliar to me. I came here to forget a life I had loved, or at least to find a place where the weight of it was bearable, and I was not looking for anything either. And then you were there, being exactly what you are, and what you are is nothing like anything I have known and everything I did not know I needed, and I think that is rather worth acknowledging out loud." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw everything in his face, the feeling and the care and the honesty that was the most essential thing about him. And then he reached out and took her hand with a gentleness that was completely characteristic of the way he did everything, and she did not pull it back. They stood there in the grasslands as the sun went down, holding hands in the middle of the Kansas territory, and Grace felt something in her chest that she recognized as happiness, real and present, and not at all like looking at her life from behind glass, but like being inside it, fully and without reservation, for the first time in a very long while. August was different from everything that had come before it. It was different in the way that certain seasons are different, not in the facts of the weather or the activity of the town, but in the quality of what it contained. Grace was in love. She knew it with the clarity of a woman who had been in love before and knew what it felt like, and also knew that this was not the same love she had had with Edmund. Not lesser and not greater, but different in the way that different things are, grown in different soil, reaching for a different kind of light. She did not feel guilty about this, which she had worried she might. Instead, she felt a curious gratitude toward the whole complicated business of being alive. Roscoe courted her with a directness that was typical of him, and a thoughtfulness that never failed to surprise her. He was not a man of grand gestures, which she had learned quickly enough, but he was a man of consistent small ones, and she had come to believe that the small ones were considerably more revealing of a person's character than the grand ones, which were often more about the giver than the recipient. He brought her books when he passed through towns that had them. He remembered that she had mentioned missing music and arranged, with considerable logistical effort she suspected, but which he presented simply as a thing that had happened, for her to attend a piano recital at the church in the next county, which she had not known existed until he mentioned it. He listened when she talked, and he talked when she asked, and he was honest in a way that made the world feel like a more solid place. She was honest with him in return, in ways she had not anticipated being honest. She told him things she had not said aloud to anyone, things she had kept in the locked room at the back of her chest for long enough that they had started to feel permanent. She told him about the particular quality of her grief for Edmund, the way it had not been only sadness, but also a kind of fury at the unfairness of it, at the 31 years and the 17 days, and the fever that had made no sense and taken everything without consultation. She had not admitted the fury to anyone, not to Catherine, not to Edmund's mother, not to the minister who had come to pray with her, because she had believed that fury was not a proper part of grief and proper was what she had been trained to be. Roscoe listened to this and said, "Fury makes sense. It would make me furious too." And that was that which was very much his way. There was a Sunday in mid-August when they sat on the ridge north of town, the same ridge he had shown her on the first ride, and watched a thunderstorm build itself on the western horizon with the slow, spectacular industry of the Great Plains, towers of cloud, rising into the blue sky in formations that would have been impossible to believe if you were not sitting there watching it happen. The thunder reached them long before the rain, a continuous low rolling that the ground seemed to absorb and send back up through the grass. "Are you afraid of it?" he asked, and she heard the echo of Edmund holding her hand in the thunder and felt it, acknowledged it, let it pass. "No," she said. "I never have been." "Good," he said, "because it's going to be impressive." It was. The storm came over them like a living thing, and they sat on their horses at the top of the ridge long past the point of wisdom, watching the lightning move across the sky in great branching lines. And then the rain arrived in a wall, and they turned the horses and rode hard for the shelter of the cottonwoods by the creek, arriving soaked to the skin, and laughing in a way that Grace had not laughed in a very long time, fully and without reserve. The kind of laughter that comes from being completely present in an experience and finding it, despite or because of everything, absolutely glorious. They stood under the cottonwoods in the rain, and he looked at her, wet and laughing, and he kissed her, which was not impulsive but which was also not planned, which is the best kind of thing. She kissed him back, and the rain continued falling through the cottonwood leaves above them, and the creek ran high and fast beside them, and Grace thought, with the part of her mind that was always slightly to the side of the immediate moment, that this was precisely the sort of thing that could not be planned and could not be recovered from and was entirely and completely worth it. September brought decisions. The drive season was ending, and Roscoe would need to go south before winter, back to Texas to oversee his herd there and prepare for the next year's push north. This was the reality of his life, not a problem but a fact, and Grace had understood it abstractly since she first understood what he did, but now it was not abstract at all. They talked about it plainly, because that was how they talked about things. "I don't want to leave here without knowing something," he said. They were at the creek in the evening, their accustomed place, the cottonwood leaves turning yellow at the edges with the first promise of autumn. "What do you want to know?" she asked. "I want to know if you'll still be here in the spring," he said, "or if you'll come south with me before that. I want to know where we're going, Grace, because I need to know I'm not going to spend the winter wondering." She looked at the water for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Ask me properly," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with everything that he was in his face, the steadiness and the warmth and the directness that had been the thing from the very beginning. "Grace Lawson," he said, "will you marry me? Not because you need to, not because you don't have anywhere else to go, but because I want to spend my life with you and I believe we would build something together that would be worth building." She had known this was coming. She had been moving toward it for months, moving toward it with the certainty of a river moving toward the sea, not because she was swept along, but because it was where she was flowing. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely and without qualification, yes." He smiled, the full smile, and reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring that she could see he had been carrying for some time, a simple gold band with a single small stone that caught the late light and held it. And he put it on her finger with the same careful, unhurried attention he gave to everything. And she looked at it on her hand and felt the past and the present occupy the same space without contradiction, which she had not known was possible. She wore Edmund's wedding ring on a chain around her neck. She had worn it there for 14 months in Boston and through the spring and summer in Caldwell. She touched it now briefly, and Roscoe saw her do it, and he did not say anything and he did not look troubled by it. And that, she thought, was the right response, and was a perfect encapsulation of why she had said yes. She wrote to her sister Catherine that evening. She wrote 8 pages, which was more than she had written to anyone since Edmund died, and she told Catherine everything, honestly and without mitigation. And she told her that she was happy in a way that felt like a choice rather than a circumstance, which was a new and extraordinary feeling. And she asked her to come to Kansas for the wedding because she could not imagine doing this without her. She wrote a brief, dignified note to Alina Lawson, who she did not expect to be happy about this and who deserved the information anyway. Gerald was, predictably, beside himself with satisfaction, in the quiet way of a man who has suspected he was going to be a proximate cause of something good and has now seen it confirmed. Mrs. Beale baked a cake. They were married in November of 1882 in the small church in Caldwell, on a day that was cold and bright with a November sky that went up forever in that particular way of Great Plains skies, as though the world above you is trying to show off. Catherine came from Boston, making the journey with the determination of a woman who would cross any terrain for her sister, and she arrived 2 days before the wedding and stood in the kitchen with Grace and held her hands and looked at her face for a long time and then said, "You look like yourself again. You actually look like yourself." Grace had not known, until that moment, how fully she had stopped looking like herself. She had not known how far she had receded from her own life. Hearing it described in Catherine's quiet, accurate way opened something in her throat that she had to breathe carefully around. "I am myself again," she said. "Or a version of myself that I think is possibly better." "Edmund would be glad," Catherine said, which was the truest and most generous thing anyone had said to her in 2 years, and Grace hugged her sister hard enough that Catherine laughed and said she needed to breathe. Roscoe on their wedding day was Roscoe, which was the best thing about it. He stood at the front of the small church in a suit that was clearly not his natural habitat, but which he wore with the composure of a man who does uncomfortable things, because the important things sometimes require them. And when Grace walked down the aisle on Gerald's arm, he watched her come toward him with an expression that she knew she would remember for the rest of her life, steady and warm and completely unhidden, as though he had decided to let her see everything without reservation. They made their promises in front of the minister, and their small congregation and Grace felt each word settle into place with the weight of something true. She was not pretending. She was not performing. She was a woman who had lost a life she loved and crossed a territory to breathe and found, completely without planning or expectation. A man who was nothing like her previous life and everything she had not known she needed. And she was marrying him in a church in Kansas on a bright November day, and every bit of it was real. There was a dinner at the hotel afterward, and Gerald gave a speech that was sentimental in the best way. and James Calloway played the fiddle with an enthusiasm that substantially exceeded his technical skill, but which nobody minded at all. And Tommy Reyes danced with Mabel Oates, the schoolteacher, in a way that suggested that situation might bear watching over the coming months. And Catherine danced with Roscoe's foreman Hank, who was considerably less taciturn in the presence of music than he was in the presence of ordinary conversation. Late in the evening, Grace stood with Roscoe at the edge of the dancing, and he had his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against the solid warmth of him, and thought about the morning she had stepped off the stage in Caldwell with the wind threatening her mourning ribbon, and the sky so big it frightened her. And she thought about all the space between that moment and this one, all the walking and the talking and the creek and the ridge and the rain under the cottonwood trees, and she thought that life, when you let it, could be astonishing. Happy, he asked, because he was a man who asked. Completely, she said, because she was a woman who was. Winter in Caldwell was a different creature from summer. The cattle drives were done, and the town settled into a quieter rhythm, and the grasslands went pale and brown, and the wind came without mercy from the north, which was the wind that made you understand what the settlers and the people who had lived on these plains long before the settlers meant when they spoke of the land's hardness. The Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples had their own long history here, displaced and diminished by the forces of expansion and policy that Grace, who had been a Boston woman with a reasonable education, understood intellectually, but understood more viscerally now that she lived on the land itself and could look at the grasslands and begin to understand what it meant to lose them. She did not carry this understanding lightly. She and Roscoe lived at Gerald's house through the winter, a temporary arrangement while Roscoe handled the Texas portion of his business by correspondence and planning, making a single trip south in December that lasted 3 weeks, and during which Grace experienced a version of missing that was different from grief, being not the endless absence of the dead, but the finite, bounded absence of a living person who would return, which was a profoundly different and considerably more bearable thing. He came back from Texas in January with plans for the spring drive already forming and a second horse for Grace, a dark bay mare he had selected personally, which he led into Caldwell on a cold morning, and presented to her with the matter-of-fact pride of a man presenting something he knows is good. "Her name is Pearl," he said. Grace ran a hand down the mare's neck, and the horse turned and regarded her with large, intelligent eyes that she found immediately trustworthy. "She's beautiful," Grace said. "She's yours," he said. She kissed him on the cold street outside Gerald's house, and Mrs. Beale watched from the window without attempting to pretend she was not watching. They found their land in February. There was a section 8 miles north of Caldwell that Gerald had been holding in his inventory, a piece of mixed grassland and creek bottom that included the ridge where Roscoe had first taken Grace to see the view, which turned out to be entirely coincidental and also felt entirely appropriate. The land was 320 acres, a half section, more than they needed immediately and exactly enough for what they intended to build. Roscoe had money from 3 years of successful drives, and Grace had the remains of Edmund's estate, which was modest but not nothing, and together they had enough to purchase the land and begin building without catastrophic financial strain, which was not a guarantee in 1883, but was as close to one as you could reasonably get. Roscoe had strong views about where the house should sit, which was on slightly elevated ground that would catch the morning light and look south over the grasslands, and Grace had strong views about the layout of the house, which was going to include a proper kitchen and a sitting room with windows on 3 sides, because she had lived in a house with velvet curtains, and she understood the difference that light made, and they had 2 conversations about these things that were the closest they had come to arguments, which were not really arguments, but were the working out of 2 strong-minded people's visions of a shared life. They compromised everywhere and got everything both wanted, which is the best kind of compromise. The house went up in the spring, built by Roscoe and Hank and Tommy Reyes, and 3 men from town who Gerald had located, and by Grace, who mixed mortar and painted and did whatever required doing, because she was not a woman who stood aside from work when work needed doing. Catherine sent a package from Boston with curtain fabric and a set of china plates that had been a wedding gift to her, and Edmund that Grace had left behind when she came west, which Catherine had kept carefully, and which arrived wrapped in so many layers of protective packing that Gerald's parlor was briefly overwhelmed with paper. Grace unwrapped the plates and held each one and felt the familiar tightening and let it move through her and be what it was, which was grief for Edmund, real and present and appropriate, and no longer the totality of her world but a room inside it, a room she could visit and leave, the door opening and closing at her will. She put the plates on the shelf in the new kitchen, and they looked entirely right there, entirely at home, and she thought that perhaps the best things travel with you without losing what they are. They moved into the house in May of 1883, 1 year after Grace had first arrived in Caldwell, and on the first night they sat on the porch in the warm spring dark and looked out at the grasslands and listened to the sounds of the territory at night, the insects and the wind, and somewhere far off a coyote making its case against the darkness. And Roscoe had his arm around her, and she had her head against his shoulder, and she felt the rightness of it with every part of herself. A rightness that was not the absence of complexity, but the presence of something worth the complexity. "Are you glad you came?" he asked. "I am glad of everything," she said. "From the letter I wrote to Gerald to the wind on the day I arrived that nearly took my hat." He laughed softly. "I would have liked to see that. It was very undignified," she said. "I had to use both hands." He kissed the top of her head, which was a thing he did that she had come to think of as his particular form of punctuation, a full stop at the end of a good sentence. The spring drove south from Texas with Roscoe's herd, now grown to 600 head, a full and proper operation, and Grace ran the ranch while he was gone, which she had prepared for all winter, and which she undertook with the complete competence she brought to things she decided to do. She had Hank and Tommy, and the knowledge of every detail of the operation that she and Roscoe had gone over together during the long winter evenings when he was planning, and she was listening and storing everything away. There were moments during those weeks when the weight of the responsibility sat heavy, and moments when something went wrong. A section of fence down in a windstorm, a problem with the water supply that required some improvisation, a disagreement with a neighboring rancher named Pruitt about a boundary line that she resolved with a combination of careful reference to the land documents, and a directness that Pruitt had clearly not expected from a woman, but which he accepted because Grace left him very little room not to. Tommy Ray's had grown close to her over the months, in the way of a young man who finds in the wife of a man he respects a kind of sisterly steadiness he had lacked. He was 19 and serious and capable, and she had quietly encouraged him in all of it, the same way she had once encouraged her students in the afternoon reading classes she had taught at the Boston Charity School, because it was her instinct to notice what was good in people and say so. Roscoe came back from the drive in July, this time earlier than the previous year, with the trail dust and the look of successful work, and he rode into their yard and Grace came out of the house, and he swung down from his horse and she walked straight into his arms and he held her there in the July heat for a long moment, his chin on top of her head, the two of them just breathing. "Good drive," she said into his shirt. "Good drive," he said. "Good to be home." Home. She felt the word in his chest when he said it, felt it resonate. "Everything's here," she said. "Better than you left it. Pruitt's fence argument is resolved." He pulled back and looked at her with amusement and admiration in equal measure. "I heard about that from 2 people before I even got through Caldwell," he said. "I was perfectly civil," she said. "I know you were," he said. "That's apparently what made it so effective." She was already with child when he returned, though she had only known for certain for 2 weeks. She told him that evening on the porch as the sun went down in the full June extravagance of color, and she watched his face as the information moved across it, from comprehension to wonder to a happiness so complete and unguarded that it made her eyes sting. "Grace," he said, which was all he said, and he said it the way you say the name of something precious. "Next winter," she said. "Sometime in January, I think." He took her hand and held it and looked at the sunset for a long moment, and she knew he was thinking about the scale of the thing, the weight and the wonder of it, because that was how he thought about things that mattered. "Are you frightened?" he asked, because he always asked. "A little," she said honestly, "and very glad." "Both of those are right," he said. Their son was born on the 14th of January, 1884, in the house on the ridge above the grasslands, delivered by the town's doctor who rode out through a January wind that he would later describe as the most formidable thing he had encountered in 3 years of frontier medicine. The labor was long and difficult, and Grace did not pretend otherwise and also did not apologize for it, because she was beyond apology by the 7th hour, and into a place that was purely about the work of the thing. Roscoe sat outside the bedroom door for 8 hours, which Grace knew because she could hear him moving, pacing, the occasional creak of the floor as he shifted from foot to foot. And when the doctor finally called him in and he came through the door and she held up their son for him to see, she watched his face in the lamplight, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in her life, which covered considerable ground at this point. He sat beside her and took the boy with exquisite care and held him against his chest and looked down at him with an expression that was completely naked of every ordinary protection a man puts between himself and the world, and Grace looked at both of them and felt the fullness of the moment like a physical thing. "What do we call him?" Roscoe asked, in the voice he used when he was trying to be steady. They had discussed this before. She said, "Edmund, after his father who was a good man. And James, after no one in particular except that it suits him." Roscoe looked up at her. He knew what she was saying. He understood it completely, which she had known he would. "Edmund James Barlow," he said. "Yes," she said. He leaned down and kissed her temple, the truest version of the gesture he made, and she closed her eyes and let everything that she was feeling simply exist inside her without trying to organize it into words or sense. The love and the history and the grief and the joy and the present moment and the future stretching out ahead of them beyond the January cold and the grasslands and the enormous dark sky. Edmund James Barlow was, from the beginning, a person of strong opinions, which surprised no one who knew his parents. He was also, from the first weeks, possessed of a quality of attention that Roscoe said was exactly his mother's. The way he watched things before responding to them, taking in the world with a seriousness that made you feel, even when he was an infant, that he was conducting a thorough assessment. Catherine came to visit in the spring of 1884 and stayed for 2 months, during which time she and Grace resumed the particular rhythm of sisters who have been close since childhood, finishing each other's sentences and disagreeing about small things with the comfort of people who know the disagreement is not going to cost them anything. Catherine rode with Grace over the grasslands, initially without enthusiasm and increasingly with pleasure, and she sat on the ridge and looked at the view that Roscoe had shown Grace 2 years earlier and said, "Well," and then said nothing further, which for Catherine was a profound statement. On the last evening before Catherine returned to Boston, they sat together on the porch while Roscoe was inside with Edmund, the sounds of a man being thoroughly defeated at some invented game by a 4-month-old floating through the open window. "He's a good man," Catherine said. "He is," Grace said. "Edmund would have liked him," Catherine said. "Edmund would have liked everything you've built here. He would have been generous about it." Grace thought about Edmund with his Friday wildflowers and his law office and his laugh, and she felt him in the way she had learned to feel him, not as a wound but as a room. "I know he would have been," she said. "That's one of the truest things about him." "You're happy," Catherine said. "Genuinely, completely happy." "I am," Grace said. "I came here to forget a life I had loved. I didn't expect to find a completely new one." "Life is inconveniently unpredictable," Catherine said, which was as close as she ever came to sentiment. "It is," Grace agreed. I'm grateful for every bit of the inconvenience." Catherine left the next morning with her trunk and her opinions and her Boston hat, and Grace stood in the yard and watched the stage carry her away, and then went back inside to Roscoe, who was eating his breakfast one-handed because Edmund was in the other arm and entirely refusing to be relocated. "Your son," he said, in the tone of a man who is deeply delighted about a situation he is pretending to find exasperating. "Our son," she corrected, and took Edmund, who laughed and grabbed a fistful of her hair with the enthusiasm that was his primary mode of engagement with the world. The years that followed were full in the way that full years are, not without difficulty, but threaded through with enough joy and work and color that the difficulty was contextual rather than defining. The ranch grew as Roscoe's herd grew, and as Grace's management of the home side of the operation became increasingly sophisticated. She kept the books, which she had an aptitude for that had been previously untested in Boston, and she organized the household with an efficiency that was not rigidity, but the kind of structure that makes room for the unexpected, which the frontier provided in regular supply. Tommy Reyes, who had been with Roscoe since the beginning, did indeed marry Mabel Oates, the schoolteacher, in 1885, which Grace attended with the satisfaction of a person who has watched a thing develop with a slow inevitability, and is pleased to see it reach its proper conclusion. The wedding was in the same church where Grace and Roscoe had married, and Grace stood in the back with Edmund on her hip and Roscoe beside her, and felt the continuity of it, the sense that the territory was weaving connections between people that would hold long after the original threads were forgotten. Amos Pratt, the sheriff, finally told Clara Webb from the millinery that he was in love with her, which happened, by Grace's understanding of subsequent events, because Grace had a direct conversation with Amos in August of 1884, in which she pointed out with her characteristic lack of ambiguity that life was shorter than anyone planning to live forever seemed to understand, and that a woman of Clara's intelligence and specific patience would not wait indefinitely. Amos took this information seriously and acted on it within a week, which Grace considered a satisfying outcome. The summer of 1886 was exceptionally dry, and the cattle business suffered across the territory as it did across the whole of the Central Plains, a hard season that tested everyone who had staked their life on the land. Roscoe's herd came through it better than many, partly because of the land they had chosen with its creek bottom that held water longer, and partly because of Roscoe's careful and continuous management of the grazing that spread the pressure rather than concentrating it. They were not unaffected, but they were not broken, which was the only standard that mattered during a drought. During that hard summer, Grace helped where she could help and held what needed holding, and at no point considered any alternative to being where she was. The life she had worried she was running away from had become, entirely through the process of living it, the life she was most completely herself inside, and that was not a small thing. Their daughter arrived in October of 1886, born on a clear autumn morning when the worst of the drought had broken, and the first rains of fall were softening the hard-baked ground. She was born easily, relatively speaking, the second birth being considerably more negotiable than the first, and she arrived with a full head of dark hair and eyes that would settle into the same direct dark brown as her father's, and a way of looking at you from the first hours of her life that suggested she was going to be a person of considerable opinions. They named her Rose Eleanor. The Eleanor was for Edmund's mother, who had surprised Grace completely by coming around in her position, not enthusiastically or openly, but in the way that remote and dignified women come around when they decide to, through a series of letters that began hostile, became civil, and ended warm enough that Grace had come to feel a genuine, if complicated, affection for her. Eleanor Lawson had written, upon hearing of Edmund James's birth, a letter so full of genuine warmth and gracious acknowledgment that Grace had had to sit down after reading it, and a correspondence had developed that was not close but was honest and mattered. So Rosa Leaner, who arrived in the October rain to find a brother of 2 3/4 who was immediately fascinated by her in the way of very small boys who have been waiting for something interesting to happen, and a father who held her in the lamplit bedroom with the same undefended expression that Grace had never stopped finding the most beautiful thing about him. "Hello, Rose," Roscoe said to his daughter. Rose Barlow looked at her father with the direct dark eyes she had inherited from him and seemed to reach a favorable conclusion. Edmund James, who had been brought in to be introduced and who had required considerable persuasion to remain still for the purpose, whispered very seriously, "She's very small," as though this were a character flaw he was prepared to overlook. "She'll get bigger," Roscoe told him. Edmund considered this information and decided it was satisfactory. Grace lay in the warmth of the October bedroom and looked at her husband with their daughter and her son beside him, and felt the day settle around her like something she had been building without knowing she was building it, brick by brick, day by day, since the morning she stepped off a stage in Caldwell with the wind in her face and grief in her chest, and the entire sky of Kansas coming down at her without apology. She had come to forget a life she had loved. She had not forgotten it. She had carried it with her, the way you carry the best things, not as a weight but as a foundation, something you stand on in order to build higher. Edmund's memory lived inside her with a kind of honored peace, and the love she had for Roscoe lived alongside it without competition or contradiction, because the heart, she had learned, was not a room of limited size, but something that expanded to hold what needed holding. She thought sometimes about the woman she had been in Boston in the 14 months after Edmund died, receding behind the velvet curtains, looking at her own life from outside. She thought about her with tenderness and some sadness and complete understanding, because that woman had not known what she had not known, and that was the nature of not knowing things. And then she had gotten on the stage and come west, and the wind had nearly taken her hat, and everything had begun. The autumn turned toward the winter of 1886 with a gentleness that the territory did not always offer, and life on the ranch settled into the particular rhythm of the cold season, the shorter days and the longer evenings, and the domestic warmth of the house on the ridge with its windows on 3 sides, and its kitchen with the china plates from Boston on the shelf, and the sound of Edmund James talking to himself as he played in the corner and Rose learning. At the extraordinary rate of new humans, the basic mechanics of existing in the world. Roscoe in the evenings read or planned, or sometimes just sat by the fire with his boots off and his daughter on his chest, his large hand covering most of her small back, and Grace sat across from him with her book or her letter writing, and looked up periodically to find him looking at her, and they would hold each other's gaze for a moment in the firelight, with everything they shared moving between them like a conversation that did not need words, and then go back to their separate occupations, with the deep ease of 2 people who have found exactly where they are supposed to be. There was a night in December when a late storm came down from the north, with a ferocity that rattled the windows and piled snow against the door, and turned the world outside into pure white sound, and they were all inside together, the 4 of them, the fire going high and Edmund James asleep in his bed, and Rosa fed and settled, and Roscoe and Grace sat close together on the settee that Catherine had sent from Boston in one of her periodic campaigns to improve the territorial domestic situation. And Roscoe said, "Are you happy? You ask me that regularly," she said. "I want to know regularly," he said. She leaned into him, into the warmth and solidity that was Roscoe, that had been Roscoe from the beginning, dependable as weather, constant as the grasslands, honest as the enormous sky. "I am profoundly, entirely, completely happy," she said. "Are you?" "I have everything I ever wanted and some things I didn't know to want," he said. "So yes, unquestionably." The storm blew itself out toward morning and left behind a world that was white and clean and silent, and Grace stood at the kitchen window with her coffee, and watched the sun come up over the grasslands and make the snow shimmer in ways that seemed improbable, but were simply what the light did here, where it had the entire sky to work with. And she thought about all the things she had not known when she was standing on that main street in the spring of 1882 with the wind in her face. She had not known Roscoe Barlow. She had not known this house on this ridge or this view from this window. She had not known that she could make bread in a cast iron oven or manage the books of a cattle operation or negotiate a fence dispute with the combination of documentation and will. She had not known that Edmund's memory could live in her as a presence rather than an absence, an honored guest rather than a haunting. She had not known that the biggest sky she had ever seen could become the sky under which she was most herself. She had not known any of it, and now she knew all of it, and the distance between those two positions was the measure of a life lived forward into its own best possibilities, which was, she thought, looking at the white and shining grasslands under the December sky, the best thing that any life could be. In the spring of 1887, Roscoe hired a young woman named Dolores Vargas, the daughter of Hector Vargas who had taught Roscoe the cattle trade in Texas, to help with the household as the ranch grew, and the children required more attention than Grace could give them while also managing the books and the correspondence and the 1,000 other things that running a working ranch required. Dolores was 22 and capable, and spoke both English and Spanish, and had a laugh that filled rooms, and she and Grace took to each other immediately with the frankness of two women who recognize in each other the same quality of not being interested in pretense. It was Dolores who taught Edmund James his first Spanish words, which he was immediately and completely devoted to, using them constantly and indiscriminately in ways that made his father laugh and his mother collect them like gifts. It was Dolores who noticed before anyone else that Rose Aliner, at 7 months, was tracking objects and sounds with an alertness that suggested she was going to be extraordinarily perceptive, which proved accurate as she grew into a child who noticed everything and asked about all of it. The ranch in the spring of 1887 was a settled and functioning thing, 400 acres under management, a herd that Roscoe was justifiably proud of, a house that was a home in every sense of the word, and 2 children growing at the alarming rate of children who are well fed and loved and properly attended to. Tommy Reyes and Mabel had their first child in April and named him Samuel, and Grace went to see them and held Samuel in the kitchen of their small house in Caldwell, and thought about all the connections that had been made across the 3 years since she had arrived on the stage, all the things that would not exist without the particular sequence of choices and accidents that had brought her here. Roscoe's drive that spring was shorter than previous years, the rail lines having moved in ways that made the routes more efficient, and he was home in June rather than July, which Grace received as a gift. He came home in the late afternoon, and she was in the garden she had established behind the house, where she grew herbs and vegetables with the same attention she gave everything. And she heard his horse and straightened and turned, and he was riding into the yard with the trail dust on him, and he swung down and walked toward her, and she went to meet him across the garden. She had grown out of the Kansas soil. And they met in the middle, and he held her, and she held him, and somewhere inside the house, Rose Aliner began making the sound she made when she was deciding whether to fuss, which Dolores intercepted with the smooth efficiency that was her particular gift. "Good drive," she said into his shoulder. "Good drive," he said. "Good to be home." "You always say that," she said. "It's always true," he said. She pulled back and looked at him, at the face that was more familiar to her now than any landscape she had ever known, the weathered skin and the dark eyes and the jaw that had given up any pretense of consistent shaving, and she thought that she could look at this face for the rest of her life and find something new in it each time, which was not a small thing to be able to say about a face. "Come inside," she said. "Edmund has been saving a story to tell you for 2 weeks, and he's been very disciplined about it, which is not natural for him, and someone should reward that. Roscoe laughed. "What's the story about?" "A bird that he rescued from Mrs. Beale's cat," she said, "though it has grown considerably in the telling, and I believe the bird may now be some kind of hawk." "Of course it is," he said, and took her hand, and they walked toward the house where their children were, and the evening was beginning and the grasslands went golden in the lowering sun. And Grace thought, as she had thought many times before and would think many times again, that she was precisely where she was supposed to be, which was a feeling she intended to spend the rest of her life honoring. The world kept moving, as worlds do. The Kansas cattle trade shifted with the decades, the railroads expanding and the open range contracting as the land filled with more settlers and more wire fences, and more of the particular kind of change that was both inevitable and melancholy, in the way of all change that takes something irreplaceable in exchange for something new. Roscoe adapted, as he always adapted, with the practical intelligence of a man who understood that the point was not to resist the moving of things, but to move with them in the direction of what mattered. By the end of the 1880s, he had shifted the operation more toward breeding and supply than trail driving, establishing the ranch as a reliable source of quality cattle for the networks of buyers that Gerald facilitated, which used Gerald's skills well and Roscoe's knowledge of cattle even better, and kept them both busy and productive, and out of each other's way in the particular companionable fashion that had characterized their professional relationship from the beginning. Edmund James, at 6 and then 7 and then 8, was everywhere on the ranch in the way of a boy who has been allowed to be curious, and has found that the world rewards curiosity with endlessly interesting information. He learned to ride properly at 4, and to help Roscoe with the simpler tasks of the cattle management at 5, and to read with a focused attention at 6 that his mother took quiet pride in, having spent the winter evenings teaching him from the books that were the particular luxury she consistently maintained no matter what other economies the season required. Rosalina, growing into the person she had announced she would be from her first day, was a child of devastating perception and strong feelings, who said exactly what she thought with a completeness that Roscoe said was entirely her mother's and Grace said was entirely her father's, and was, in fact, the result of both of them operating in a household where honesty was the default language. She loved animals with a particular devotion that led to a series of increasingly unauthorized domestic arrangements that dolers managed with patient creativity. Gerald Lawson remained in Caldwell and prospered there as the territory grew, and he came to Sunday dinners with a regularity that made him in practice a member of the family, which he was in the sense that mattered. He never married, which he seemed completely content about, being a man who found his satisfactions in work and friendship, and the general business of being in the middle of things, which Caldwell provided in adequate supply. There were hard things, as there are always hard things. There was the winter of 1888 when a disease moved through the herd, and they lost 30 head, and Roscoe spent 2 weeks working with the remaining cattle with a focused intensity that Grace watched from the distance of not wanting to interrupt, understanding that some work a person has to do alone. She was there when he came in at the end of the worst of it, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee already made, and she did not say anything platitudinous because he did not want platitudes, and he sat down and drank his coffee, and she put her hand over his on the table, and they sat there together in the kitchen in the quiet of the late evening until he was ready to talk, and then he talked and she listened, and it was enough. There was grief in the decade. Hank, the taciturn foreman, died in 1889 of the kind of sudden illness that the territory delivered without warning, and his death left a gap in the operation and in the daily texture of their lives that was felt by everyone. Roscoe carried it quietly, as he carried things, and Grace did not try to diminish it or hurry it, but was simply present with him through it, which was what she had learned was the most useful kind of love. There was the death of Edmund's mother, Eleanor Lawson, in 1890, which Grace felt more than she expected to, the connection between them having grown through letters into something genuine. She sat with that grief for several days and let it be what it was, a small, specific sadness for a difficult woman who had, in the end, found her way to Grace, and who had written to Grace in the last year of her life with a warmth that had surprised both of them. And there was joy in the decade, in the abundant and continuous way that joy operates when a life is well made. Edmund James's first successful cattle management, at age 9, conducted with the seriousness of a person who has decided to excel at something and is not going to be deterred by being 9. Rose Aliner's discovery of music, specifically the fiddle, which she took up with a passion that filled the house with enthusiastic and initially chaotic sound that gradually, as years passed, became genuinely good. Tommy Ray's and Mabel's family growing, Samuel followed by 2 more children, their household in Caldwell, a frequent destination for Edmund James and Rose Aliner, who regarded Tommy's children as close to cousins. The evening that Grace would perhaps remember longest from those years was an ordinary one in the summer of 1890. Edmund James was 6, Rose Aliner 3, and Dolers had taken both children for an evening walk, and Grace and Roscoe were alone on the porch in the way they rarely were, the quiet of the house behind them and the grasslands golden before them and the creek shining in the distance. And it was the creek she had been walking to on the evening that she had found Roscoe crouching at the water's edge, all those years ago, and they were on the porch of the house on the ridge above it. And she said, thinking of that first evening, "Do you remember when I found you at the creek?" "I remember all of it," he said. He always said that because it was always true. "I walked around that bend and there you were," she said, "and you said the creek was big enough for both of us. And you sat on the rock," he said, 15 feet from me and didn't say a word for half an hour. 8 feet, she said, and it was a very comfortable silence. "It was the best silence I'd ever sat in," he said. She took his hand in the evening quiet and held it and looked at the grasslands and the creek and the sky that went up forever in that particular Kansas way, and she felt everything that the years contained inside the single moment, the fullness of it, the weight and the wonder. "I love you," she said, not as a revelation, but as a statement of something permanent. "I love you, Grace," he said, which he said the way he said her name when it mattered, as though the syllables of it were each individually worth the care. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together as the sun went down over the grasslands, and the first stars came out in the enormous dark above them, and the coyote somewhere far out made its evening case against the silence, and the creek ran over its stones in the dark below the ridge, and the house behind them held everything they had built, and Grace Lawson Barlow, who had come to the territory to forget a life she had loved and found instead a life she had not known was possible, sat on her porch in the Kansas evening and was, in every possible sense of the word, exactly and completely home. The years that followed deepened everything that had already been built. Edmund James grew into a young man of 15, who was his father's partner in the ranch work and his mother's partner in the reading, and who had, somewhere in the combination of his 2 parents, developed into a person of both practicality and sensitivity that made him suited for a large range of things, only some of which involved cattle. Rose Aliner at 12 was playing the fiddle at church dances, her dark eyes serious with the concentration of a performer who takes the music personally, and she was reading everything she could get her hands on with her mother's appetite for books and her father's habit of developing genuine opinions about what she read. They had the same argument on alternate evenings about whether she had done her arithmetic before reaching for the novel, and Grace occasionally took Rose Aliner's side on this argument, not because she thought arithmetic was less important, but because she recognized in her daughter the particular hunger for stories that she had felt herself at 12, and she thought that a hunger of that quality deserved some degree of accommodation. Roscoe watched these arguments with an expression that was completely neutral, and which Grace knew concealed the deepest possible amusement, because he had learned over the years that inserting himself into the argument was a strategy without upside. There was a third child in 1892, another son, born in March on a day that was trying to be spring but had not entirely decided, the sky uncertain and the grassland still pale from winter. They named him William Gerald, the Gerald for his mother's cousin without whom none of the rest of it would have occurred, and Gerald's reaction to this news was the most undignified thing Grace had ever seen him do, which was to sit down hard in his office chair and say, "Well, my lord," 3 times in a row. William Gerald Barlow arrived with his father's dark eyes and his mother's tenacity, and a set of opinions about sleeping schedules that he expressed with a volume that Edmund James, at age 8, found somewhat startling, and Rose Leaner, at age 5, found completely fascinating. The house on the ridge was full in the way that houses are full when the people inside them are fully themselves, loud and warm and sometimes complicated, and always, underneath everything, grounded in the kind of love that does not need to announce itself because it is simply the medium in which everything else exists. Gerald Lawson sold his land office business in 1893 to a younger man and built himself a small house half a mile from the Barlow Ranch, having decided, at the age of 45, that he had spent enough of his professional life facilitating other people's land arrangements, and was going to spend the remainder of it reading and fishing in the creek, and eating at Roscoe and Grace's table on a frequency that made him effectively a resident. He spent considerable time teaching Edmund James and Rose Leaner and William Gerald things from books he had collected over the years, and developed a relationship with all 3 children that was distinctly his own, part honorary uncle and part peculiar family member and fully Gerald, which was exactly what he had always been. On the 25th of May, 1895, Grace and Roscoe sat on the porch together in the late afternoon light, which was the same light they had sat in on the first evening she had found him at the creek 13 years earlier, and Gerald was inside with the 3 children doing something that involved considerable noise, and what appeared to be a game involving cards and an escalating system of stakes that he had invented for the purpose. And the ranch was quiet around them with the particular quiet of a late spring evening when everything is growing, and the air carries the smell of grass and the creek water and the particular sweetness of the season. Edmund James was 11 and growing fast, and Rose Leaner was 8 and fierce, and William Gerald was 3, and entirely ruling the household through a combination of volume and charm that suggested he had taken careful notes on the strategies of his older siblings and synthesized them into something more effective. Roscoe's herd was the best it had ever been, the breeding operation having developed a reputation across the territory that brought buyers from considerable distances. Grace's household accounts were immaculate, and her garden was magnificent, and her correspondence with her sister Catherine, who had made 3 more visits to Kansas, and had stopped pretending she did not love the grasslands, was the most satisfying epistolary relationship of her life. Roscoe looked at her in the late afternoon light, the way he had always looked at her, with the directness that had never diminished, and she looked back at him with the same openness that had grown over 13 years from something discovered into something essential, the way a river grows from its source until you cannot imagine the landscape without it. "I have been thinking about something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I was thinking about how you almost didn't stay," he said. "That first spring, you told me once that you had told Catherine you were only visiting for the season." "I was going to leave," she said. "I had every intention of leaving." "What made you stay?" he asked, though they had talked about this before in versions. She thought about it honestly, which was the way she thought about things she had thought about before when the question deserved a fresh answer. "The sky," she said. "The creek. The quiet. Gerald's cheerful incompetence at filing. Mrs. Beale's bread. Clara at the millinery, all of it. And then you came through the office door without knocking, and you said the creek was big enough for both of us, and something settled inside me that I had not been able to settle for a year and a half, and I began to understand that I was not visiting, I was arriving. He looked at her for a long moment. I walked into that office, and you were standing there with those papers, and you looked at me like you were deciding something, he said. I had never wanted a woman to decide something so fast in my life. She laughed. What were you deciding? To come back, he said. Whatever excuse I needed to come back. Gerald's filing was a gift to us both, she said. He reached over and took her hand, which he had been doing for 13 years in this particular easy way, and held it in his larger one, and they sat in the late afternoon light looking at the grasslands they owned and had worked and had built upon, and the sky above them was every shade of gold, and rose in the beginning of the evening. And somewhere below the ridge, the creek ran over its stones in the uninterrupted conversation it had been having with the land since long before either of them arrived and would continue having long after. And inside the house Gerald's voice rose in mock outrage at something one of the children had done, followed by the laughter of all three of them. And it was the sound of their life, full and specific and real. Grace Lawson Barlow held her husband's hand on the porch of the home she had built in the territory she had come to for grief and found, transformed into something she did not have a word grand enough for. And she thought about the woman she had been on the stage from Boston, clutching her ticket and her trunk and her determination to breathe. And she felt for that woman the deepest tenderness, because that woman had been brave enough to go without knowing where going would lead, and it had led here, to this porch. To this man, to these children, to this enormous, indifferent, magnificent sky. She had come to forget a life she had loved. She had not forgotten it. She had brought it with her, the best parts of it carried forward, the grief transformed over time into something that bore the shape of gratitude. She had found a man who was nothing like the life she had known, nothing like the parlors and the piano and the law offices and the velvet curtains, nothing like anything she had been prepared for, and he was everything she had not known she needed, which was the best kind of everything, the kind that comes without warning and stays without condition. The sun went down over the Kansas grasslands in the full extravagance of a May evening, painting the sky in colors that no velvet curtain in Boston had ever contained, and Grace and Roscoe sat together on the porch as the first stars appeared above them, as the coyote made its usual argument with the dark, as the creek ran below the ridge in its ancient and unhurried way, and everything that had been was held inside everything that was. And everything that would be was already beginning in the warm and ordinary miracle of the continuing day. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the way of the very best lives, precisely and exactly everything.